when the world turns to ash, one man's obsession becomes your only sanctuary. But what is this love? A lifeline in the abyss, or a silk noose that won't let you breathe? The air in the Ministry of Magic had tasted of copper and ozone, a frantic symphony of shattering glass and the jagged screams of spells cutting through the dark. Then, there was only the suffocating pressure of apparition, a sensation of being pulled through a needle's eye, and the sudden, violent transition to silence. Hermione hit the floor hard. The cold stone of the floorboards bit into her knees, and the sudden stillness was more terrifying than the roar of the battle she had just been plucked from. She scrambled to her feet, lungs burning, her fingers instinctively reaching for the pocket of her robes. Empty. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her wand was gone. "Don't!" A voice cut through the shadows. It was low, raspy, and achingly familiar. She spun around. The room was vast, swallowed by a gloom that even the flickering candlelight in the high sconces couldn't fully pierce. Heavy velvet curtains, the color of dried blood, muffled the world outside where rain lashed against the glass. Draco Malfoy stood by the fireplace, his silhouette sharp against the dying embers. He looked different, thinner, his face a pale mask of exhaustion, his black suit buttoned to the chin as if to hold his crumbling composure together. In his hand, he held two wands. One was his own, hawthorn and unicorn hair. The other was hers. "Malfoy," she breathed, her voice cracking. "What is this? Where have you taken me?" He didn't answer immediately. He stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under his dragon-hide boots. The distance between them shrank until she could smell the scent of rain, expensive cologne, and the metallic tang of old magic clinging to him. He raised her wand, looking at it with a detached, clinical interest. "Give it back," she demanded, her chin trembling despite the fire in her eyes. "If you're going to kill me, do it. If you're going to take me to him, then let's go. But don't stand there like a coward." Draco's eyes, grey as a winter sea, flickered to hers. There was no triumph in them, no malice, only a hollow, echoing void that chilled her more than any curse could. "You always did talk too much, Granger," he whispered. Without warning, he flicked his wrist. A jet of flame erupted from the hearth, and before she could scream, he tossed her wand into the heart of the fire. Hermione lunged forward, a cry of pure agony escaping her throat. That wand was her connection to the world, her defense, her very identity. She felt as if he had reached into her chest and extinguished a part of her soul. But Draco caught her by the waist, his arm like a band of iron, pulling her back with a strength that felt desperate. "Let me go!" she shrieked, clawing at his sleeve. "You monster! That was my life!" "That was a beacon," he hissed into her ear, his breath hot against her skin. "And as long as you have it, they can find you. He can find you." He spun her around to face him, his grip migrating to her shoulders. He held her firmly, pinning her against the cold reality of the situation. Hermione looked up at him, her chest heaving, tears of rage and confusion blurring her vision. She expected him to smirk. She expected the arrogant sneer of the boy she had known at Hogwarts. Instead, she saw a man standing on the edge of a precipice. His hands were shaking. "This is Malfoy Manor, isn't it?" she whispered, looking around the oppressive grand room. "You've brought me here for information, to be interrogated." "Yes," he said, the words sounding forced, a lie told to himself as much as to her. The Dark Lord wants to know where the safe houses are. He wants the locations of the Order's outposts. I told him I would break you myself, that I was the only one who knew how to dismantle that insufferable mind of yours. I will tell you nothing, she spat, her voice thick with defiance. I would rather die. I know, Draco replied, and for a fleeting second his grip softened. His thumb brushed against the fabric of her sleeve, a ghost of a touch that felt entirely too intimate for a captor and a prisoner. But you aren't going to die, Granger. Not tonight. Not ever, if I have any say in it. He pushed her back, creating a distance that felt like a sudden drop in temperature. He gestured toward a heavy oak door at the far end of the room. That is your chamber. It is warded. Don't bother trying the windows. They are reinforced with ancient magic that would turn your bones to ash before you touched the latch. There is food. There is clothing. And when does the breaking begin, Malfoy? She asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm to mask the terror. He paused at the door, his hand on the silver handle. He didn't look back. The flickering candlelight cast long, distorted shadows across his face, making him look like a ghost inhabiting a living body. It's already begun, he said quietly. The door clicked shut, the sound of the lock turning echoing like a gavel. Hermione stood in the center of the room, the silence of the manor pressing in on her ears. She ran to the fireplace, but the wand was gone, reduced to white ash and a lingering scent of burnt wood. She sank to her knees, the reality of her isolation washing over her. She was a prisoner in the heart of the enemy's territory. She was powerless, wandless, and at the mercy of a man who had spent years loathing her existence. But as she sat there in the dark, she realized something that didn't fit the narrative of a Death Eater's triumph. When he had held her, he wasn't looking at her like a prize or a victim. He was looking at her like a man who had just committed a crime to save a life he wasn't supposed to care about. The rain continued to beat against the glass, a rhythmic, relentless sound that underscored the suffocating atmosphere of her new reality. She wasn't just in a cell. She was in a sanctuary built of glass and lies, and the man who held the key was as much a prisoner as she was. Hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and fear. Eventually, she forced herself to stand and move toward the chamber he had indicated. It was a bedroom, lavishly appointed in shades of silver and emerald, but it felt like a mausoleum. On the bed lay a set of clean, high-quality robes and a tray of tea that was still steaming, as if timed perfectly for her entry. She didn't touch the tea. She paced the room, testing the walls, feeling the hum of the wards. They were dense, intricate, and layered with a complexity she had only read about in restricted texts. This wasn't a standard detention cell. This was a fortress within a fortress. She stopped by the window, pressing her forehead against the cool pane. Below, the gardens of Malfoy Manor stretched out like a dark, labyrinthine sea. Somewhere out there, Harry and Ron were fighting. Somewhere out there, people were dying. And here she was, preserved in a bubble of terrifying safety. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She waited for the door to burst open, for Bellatrix Lestrange to enter with a knife, or for the Dark Lord himself to come for his answers. Instead, there was only the sound of a single pair of footsteps retreating down the hall. Slow, deliberate, heavy with a weight that had nothing to do with the physical world. Hermione realized then that the most dangerous thing about her captivity wasn't the threat of pain. It was the terrifying, silent intimacy of being watched over by a man who had destroyed her world just to keep her in his. The war was outside, screaming and bloody. But inside these walls, a different kind of war had begun. One fought in the silence between breaths, in the shadows of a burning wand, and in the grey, haunted eyes of a boy who had finally decided what was worth saving. She curled up on the rug, refusing to use the bed, refusing to accept the comfort offered by her enemy. She would find a way out. She would break his wards, his resolve, or his heart, whichever came first. But as sleep finally claimed her, the last thing she remembered was the way Draco's hand had trembled when he told her she wouldn't die. It wasn't the touch of a killer. It was the touch of a man who was already mourning the version of himself that had to become a monster to keep her alive. The first week of captivity was a masterclass in psychological erosion. Hermione did not measure time by a clock, but by the rhythmic arrival of trays of food that appeared with a soft pop of house elf magic, and the heavy, lingering silence that followed the sound of Draco Malfoy's footsteps in the corridor. He came every evening at sunset. He never knocked. The door would swing open, and the dying light of the sun would catch the sharp angles of his face, casting long, skeletal shadows across the silver carpets. He would sit in a high-backed velvet chair by the window, never crossing into the center of the room, as if an invisible line of fire separated them. He would bring a leather-bound ledger and a quill, the scratching of nib against parchment the only sound for hours. "Tell me about the Forest of Dean," he said one evening, his voice devoid of its usual sneer. It was flat, a hollow imitation of an interrogator's tone. Hermione sat on the edge of the bed, her spine a rigid line of defiance. "I told you, we were never there." "Lying is beneath you, Granger. It's inefficient." He didn't look up from his ledger. "The Dark Lord knows you were spotted near the borders. He wants the coordinates of the protective enchantments you used. He wants to know how you hid 3 people from a legion of snatchers." "Then let him come and ask me himself," she bit out, her fingers twisting in the fabric of the robes he had provided, fine, heavy silk that felt like a betrayal against her skin. "Why are you the only one I see, Draco? Where is your aunt? Where are the others? Or is the great Malfoy heir now reduced to the role of a mere jailer?" Draco's quill snapped. The sound was like a pistol shot in the quiet room. He finally looked at her, and the raw intensity in his grey eyes made her breath hitch. It wasn't hatred. It was a flickering, frantic kind of desperation, like a trapped animal realizing the cage is shrinking. "You think this is a game?" he hissed, standing up. The chair scraped harshly against the floor. "You think I'm holding you here for my own amusement? If my aunt knew you were in this wing, she would have carved her name into your chest before the sun went down. If he knew you were here, you wouldn't be sitting on a silk duvet. You would be a pile of ash in the courtyard." He took a step toward her, crossing that invisible line. Hermione didn't flinch, though her heart was drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Then why?" she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her confusion. "If you're not interrogating me for him, why keep me? Deliver me or kill me, but stop this pretense." "I am interrogating you," he insisted, though the words felt brittle. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her face, his fingers twitching as if he wanted to touch her and was terrified of the consequence. "I am breaking you. That is the report I send every night. I tell them you are stubborn. I tell them your mind is fortified with occlumency, and that I am peeling back the layers slowly, painfully. I tell them that to move too fast would break the prize and lose the information." He leaned in closer, and Hermione was struck by the sheer exhaustion radiating from him. There were dark bruises under his eyes, and his skin was so pale it was almost translucent. "I am buying you days, Granger," he whispered, his voice so low she had to lean in to hear him. "I am buying you hours, and you spend them trying to provoke me into a mistake." "I didn't ask to be bought," she flared, the heat of her anger rising to meet his proximity. "I am a soldier of the Order. My friends are out there dying while I sit here in a velvet prison being saved by a man who stands for everything I fight against. Do you have any idea how much I hate you for this? For making me a coward by proxy?" Draco's face contorted. He suddenly reached out and grabbed her wrist, his grip not painful, but possessive. He jerked her toward him, forcing her to stand. The height difference was sudden and overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the cold stone of the manor. "You want to go back?" he snarled, his restraint finally snapping. "You want to go back to the mud and the hunger and the certain death? You want to be a martyr so badly that you'll throw away the only hand that's pulling you out of the fire?" "It's not your hand to pull," she screamed back. "It's my life, my choice." They stood there, chests heaving, mere inches apart. The tension between them was a living thing, a jagged electric current that threatened to incinerate the air. Hermione's gaze dropped to his mouth, then back to his eyes, terrified by the sudden, violent urge to close the distance. It wasn't desire, not yet, but a desperate need to anchor herself to something real in this nightmare of luxury and lies. Draco's gaze was equally fractured. He looked at her as if she were a miracle he couldn't afford to believe in. His thumb brushed against the pulse point of her wrist, a slow, deliberate movement that sent a jolt of pure electricity through her. "You are so remarkably stupid for someone so brilliant," he murmured, his anger curdling into a dark, suffocating tenderness. He let go of her as if her skin had burned him. He turned on his heel and strode toward the door, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. "Eat your dinner, Granger," he threw over his shoulder. "And for God's sake, stop trying to pick the lock on the window. I increased the voltage on the wards. If you touch the glass again, you'll lose the skin on your hands." The door slammed and the lock clicked. Hermione sank back onto the bed, her wrist still tingling where he had held her. She looked at the window, where the moon was beginning to rise over the dark canopy of the Wiltshire woods. She felt a sickening realization dawning in her gut. He wasn't just keeping her from the wall, he was keeping her from herself. Every night he asked questions he didn't care about the answers to. Every night he wrote reports that were works of fiction. He was weaving a web of deception so vast that it would eventually swallow him whole, all to maintain the sanctity of this one room. She walked to the desk where he had been sitting. The ledger was gone, but a single drop of ink had fallen onto the silver carpet. She knelt and touched it. It was still wet. She thought of the way he had looked at her, the guilt, the obsession, the fractured devotion. He was a man drowning, and he had decided that she was the only thing worth holding on to as he went under. But as the hours ticked by and the manor settled into its predatory silence, Hermione couldn't shake the most terrifying thought of all. She was beginning to look for the sound of his footsteps. She was beginning to crave the friction of their arguments, because it was the only thing that made her feel alive in this golden tomb. She went to the washstand and splashed cold water on her face, trying to scrub away the feeling of his thumb on her pulse. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her hair was a wild nest, her eyes were sunken, and she looked like a ghost. "I have to get out," she whispered to her reflection. But as she looked at the door, she knew the truth. The locks weren't the problem. The problem was the way Draco Malfoy looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, as if she were the only light left in a world that had gone completely dark. And she didn't know if she had the strength to extinguish it. The next morning, the tray of food didn't appear. Instead, the door opened early. Draco walked in, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't sit. He walked straight to her and threw a folded piece of parchment onto the bed. "They found the Lovegood house," he said, his voice trembling with a suppressed emotion she couldn't identify. "Potter escaped, but the house is gone. Your friends are moving, Granger. They're scared. They're making mistakes." Hermione's heart plummeted. "Is he okay? Is Harry?" "He's alive," Draco snapped. "For now. But the Dark Lord is losing patience with my interrogation. He wants results. He wants me to use the Cruciatus on you tomorrow." He stepped closer, his shadow engulfing her. "So, tonight, we are going to make it look like I did." The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. Hermione looked at him, searching for the lie, but all she saw was the terrifying, jagged edge of a man who would do anything to keep his prize hidden, even if it meant breaking her himself to save her from a worse fate. "Stay away from me," she whispered, backing away until she hit the wall. "I can't," he said, and the brokenness in his voice was the most frightening thing she had ever heard. "I've gone too far to stay away." The air in the room grew heavy, saturated with the scent of old dust and the ozone of the dark wards Draco had layered over the door. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the chamber in a bruised purple twilight. Hermione pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. "Make it look like you did," she repeated, her voice a fragile thread. "What does that even mean, Draco? Are you going to torture me for show, to satisfy some bloodlust in the hallway?" Draco didn't move. He stood in the center of the room, his hands clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles were bone white. He looked like a man standing before a firing squad, his composure held together by nothing more than the sheer force of his will. "Sound carries in this house," he said, his voice a low, guttural rasp. "The portraits watch. The walls have ears that bleed into the drawing room below. If they don't hear you scream tonight, they will come in here to find out why. And if they come in, I cannot stop them." He took a step toward her. It was a slow, predatory movement, but his eyes were filled with a desperate, fractured light. "I need you to scream, Hermione. I need to make the reports true." "I won't," she spat, though her knees felt like water. "I won't give you the satisfaction. I won't help you play this sick game of yours. If you want to play the Death Eater, then do it. Cast the curse. Let's see if you have the stomach for it." In an instant, he was across the room. He didn't use his wand. He slammed his hand against the wall beside her head, the impact echoing like a crack of thunder. He leaned in so close that their foreheads almost touched, his scent, sandalwood and sharp metallic fear, invading her senses. "You think I want this?" he hissed, his voice cracking. "You think I enjoy waking up every morning knowing that my life depends on how well I can lie about destroying yours? I am trying to keep you breathing. I am trying to keep you in this room because the moment you leave it, you are a corpse." "I'm already a corpse," she shrieked, her own restraint finally shattering. She pushed against his chest, her hands meeting the hard, unyielding line of his ribs. "Look at me. I'm a ghost in a silk dress. You've taken my wand, my friends, my purpose. You've locked me in a cage and you call it mercy. It's not mercy, Draco. It's theft." He grabbed her wrists, pinning them against the wall above her head. The physical contact was a shock, a sudden surge of heat that made her vision swim. His grip was firm, nearly bruising, but it wasn't the touch of a torturer. It was the touch of someone who was drowning and had finally found a rock to cling to. "Scream," he commanded, his eyes boring into hers. "Now." "No." He leaned his weight into her, his body a solid, warm pressure that forced the air from her lungs. "They are listening, Hermione. Bellatrix is in the drawing room. She's waiting for a reason to come up those stairs. Do you want her to find you? Do you want her to finish what she started at the ministry?" The mention of his aunt sent a cold shiver of pure terror down Hermione's spine. She remembered the glint of the silver knife, the madness in Bellatrix's eyes. She looked at Draco, at the sharp, aristocratic lines of his face, and saw the mask slipping. He wasn't the boy who had called her names in the hallways of Hogwarts. He was a man who had sold his soul to buy her a few more days of life. "Do it," he whispered, his face inches from hers. "For the love of God, help me save you." Hermione closed her eyes. A sob rose in her throat, not of pain, but of a crushing, suffocating helplessness. She opened her mouth and let out a long, piercing wail of faux agony. It tore through the quiet of the manor, a jagged blade of sound that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones. Draco flinched as if the sound had physically struck him. He didn't let go of her wrists. Instead, he dropped his head to the crook of her neck, his breath hot and ragged against her skin. "Again," he choked out. She screamed again, and then again, the sounds becoming more convincing as her own psychological distress bled into the performance. She wept, the tears hot and real, spilling down her cheeks and onto his shoulder. She felt him shudder against her. He was shaking, vibrating with a tension so high it felt as if he might shatter. "Enough," he finally whispered, though his voice was barely audible over the sound of her gasping sobs. He didn't pull away. He stayed there, his forehead pressed against her neck, his grip on her wrists softening until he was merely holding her hands against the stone. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the residue of their shared deception. It was a private, claustrophobic intimacy that felt more transgressive than any curse. "I hate you," she whispered into his hair, her voice broken. "I hate you for making me do this." "I know," he murmured. "I hate me too." He slowly lowered her hands, but he didn't step back. He let his fingers slide down her arms, a slow, lingering trail of fire that left her skin tingling. He looked at her then, his grey eyes searching her face with a raw, bleeding honesty. "I brought you something," he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its usual coldness, though it was a thin veil. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound book. It wasn't a ministry ledger. It was a Muggle novel, its edges frayed and worn. "I found it in a raid months ago," he said, staring at the cover as if it were a dangerous artifact. "I was supposed to burn it. I didn't. I thought you might be going mad without something to challenge that insufferable brain of yours." Hermione reached out, her fingers trembling as she took the book. It was a collection of poetry. She looked from the book back to Draco, her heart performing a strange, painful somersault in her chest. "You kept this?" she asked. "For me?" "I kept it because I'm a fool," he snapped, the walls of his persona slamming back into place. He turned away, walking toward the door with a sudden, jerky urgency. "Don't let the house elf see it. Hide it under the mattress." "Draco!" she called out before he could reach the handle. He paused, his back to her. "Why are you doing this? Truly. It's not just for information. You've never used anything I've told you. You're risking everything. Your family, your standing, your life. For what?" He stood perfectly still for a long moment. The candlelight flickered, casting his shadow across the door like a dark, protective wing. "Because the world is ending, Hermione," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "And I decided I didn't want to be alone in the dark when it happens." He opened the door and vanished into the hallway, the lock clicking with its usual finality. Hermione stood in the middle of the room, clutching the book of poetry to her chest. The silence of the manor felt different now, less like a tomb and more like a waiting room. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark woods. The rain had stopped, and the moon was a silver scythe in the sky. She realized with a jolt of terror that she was no longer just his prisoner. She was his accomplice. Every scream she had faked, every meal she had eaten, every hour she had survived in this room was a stitch in a tapestry of treason they were weaving together. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened the book. On the inside cover, in a cramped, hurried hand, a name had been crossed out. Above it, in fresh ink that still smelled of the desk downstairs, was a single letter, H. She ran her thumb over the letter, her heart aching with a conflict so sharp it felt like a physical wound. He was her enemy. He was a murderer, a coward, a boy who had stood by while her world burned. And yet, he was the only thing standing between her and the abyss. She began to read, the words of the Muggle poet blurring before her eyes. "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." She closed the book and laughed, a dry, bitter sound that died in the vastness of the room. She wasn't the master of anything. She was a bird in a cage of silk and stone, and the man who held the key was slowly, agonizingly, becoming the only world she knew. As the night deepened, she heard the distant, muffled sound of shouting from the floors below. Bellatrix, perhaps, or another Death Eater arriving with news of the war. But here, in the silver and emerald gloom, there was only the sound of her own breathing and the ghost of Draco's touch on her wrists. She lay down on the bed, the book tucked under her pillow. For the first time since her capture, she didn't dream of escape. She dreamt of the way Draco had looked when he said he didn't want to be alone. It was a dream that felt far more dangerous than any nightmare. Somewhere in the depths of the manor, a clock chimed the midnight hour. The sound was a reminder that time was running out. The lies could only last so long. The screams could only satisfy the shadows for so many nights. Soon, the door would open, and it wouldn't be Draco Malfoy standing there. Hermione gripped the edge of the duvet, her knuckles white. She had to find a way to save him, she realized. Not for the Order, not for the war, but because he had traded his soul for hers, and she couldn't bear the thought of him being left in the dark alone. The realization was a betrayal of everything she believed in. And yet, as she drifted into a fitful sleep, it was the only thing that felt true. The heat of the summer had turned the manor into a gilded oven, the air inside the warded room thick and stagnant, smelling of old paper and the cloying sweetness of the lilies that Draco brought to replace the scent of decay. Hermione's world had shrunk to the dimensions of this chamber. She knew every crack in the ceiling, every thread in the silver rugs, and every shift in the tone of Draco's footsteps. He was late. The sun had already surrendered to the horizon, leaving a jagged line of fire across the Wiltshire hills, but the door remained stubbornly shut. Hermione paced the length of the room, her bare feet making no sound on the velvet. Her heart was a frantic bird against her ribs. In this place, routine was the only thing that kept the madness at bay. Silence was not peace. It was an omen. When the lock finally turned, the sound was jagged, as if the key were being forced by a trembling hand. The door swung open, and Draco stumbled in. He didn't go to his chair. He leaned against the closed door, his head falling back against the wood with a dull thud. His cloak was torn at the shoulder, and the smell of ozone and burnt hair preceded him. But it was his face that stopped her heart. He was paler than she had ever seen him, a ghostly, translucent white, and a thin trail of blood ran from his hairline down to his jaw, stark as a ruby on marble. Draco? The name slipped out before she could catch it, stripped of its usual venom. He didn't open his eyes. "Don't," he rasped. "Don't start with the questions, Granger. Not tonight." She approached him tentatively, the way one might approach a wounded predator. The power dynamic in the room had shifted. The jailer was broken, and the prisoner was the only one left standing. "You're hurt," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She reached out, her hand hovering near his face, before she caught herself and pulled back. "What happened? Was it the Order?" He let out a short, bitter laugh that turned into a wince. "The Order? No. It was a lesson, a reminder of what happens when my reports are deemed insufficient." He finally opened his eyes, and the raw agony in them made her stomach flip. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the look of someone who had reached the end of his endurance. He slid down the door, his legs giving way, until he was sitting on the floor, his head lolling against the panels. Hermione didn't hesitate this time. She knelt beside him, ignoring the inner voice that screamed he was the enemy. She grabbed the silk handkerchief from the washstand and dipped it into the basin of cool water. "Stay still," she commanded, her voice regaining its authoritative edge. "Get away from me," he muttered, though there was no strength in the rebuff. "I'm a Death Eater, remember? I'm the one who put you in this hole. And I'm the one who's going to stop you from bleeding all over your expensive rug," she retorted, gently pressing the wet cloth to the wound on his forehead. He hissed as the cold water hit the cut, his hand reflexively flying up to catch her wrist. For a moment, they stayed frozen. His fingers were ice cold, his grip desperate. He stared at her, his gaze traveling over her face, as if he was seeing her for the first time, or perhaps the last. "Why do you care?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "I stole your life. I keep you in a cage like a pet. You should be happy I'm bleeding." "I'm not a monster, Draco," she said softly, her eyes locked on his. "And despite how hard you try to convince me otherwise, I don't think you are either." He let out a ragged breath, his grip on her wrist loosening, his hand sliding down to rest in the palm of hers. It was the first time they had touched without the pretense of violence or restraint. It was a quiet, devastating surrender. Hermione continued to clean the wound, her movements methodical and tender. She worked in silence, the only sound the distant rumble of thunder from a brewing storm. As she wiped away the blood, she noticed the faint, rhythmic shaking of his shoulders. "He knows," Draco said suddenly, his voice hollow. "He doesn't know you're here specifically, but he knows I'm hiding something. He can feel the gaps in my mind, the places where I've built walls he can't see over. He used the Cruciatus for 10 minutes today just to see if the walls would crack." Hermione felt a cold wave of horror wash over her. She looked at his hands. They were still trembling. She realized then that every hour of safety she enjoyed in this room was paid for in the currency of his agony. Every meal, every book, every breath she took was a debt written in the scars on his soul. "You have to let me go," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "If you let me go, the lie ends. You can tell him I escaped, that I overpowered you. You won't have to suffer for me anymore." Draco's eyes snapped to hers, flashing with a sudden, fierce intensity. He grabbed both of her hands, squeezing them until it hurt. "No," he snarled. "If you leave this room, you die. The snatchers are thick on the grounds. The wards are keyed to my life force. If you break them, the alarm will alert every dark wizard within 10 miles. You are safe here, Hermione. Only here." "I am not safe if it costs you your life," she cried, pulling her hands away. "How can you think I could live with that? To be the reason you're tortured to death?" "Because it's the only thing I've ever done that matters," he shouted back, his voice echoing in the vastness of the chamber. He stood up abruptly, ignoring his injuries, and began to pace the room like a caged animal. "My whole life has been a series of scripts written by someone else. Be the heir, be the pureblood, be the servant. I've spent 17 years being a shadow of my father's expectations. But this, keeping you alive, this is mine. It's the only choice I've ever made that wasn't dictated by fear or duty." He stopped in front of her, his chest heaving. The candlelight cast a flickering glow over his fractured expression. "I don't expect you to love me, Granger. I don't even expect you to forgive me. But don't you dare ask me to stop. You are the only part of my world that isn't rotting. Let me have this one thing." Hermione stood up slowly, her heart breaking for the boy who'd become a man in the worst possible way. She saw the truth now. His protection wasn't just about her survival. It was his penance. He was using her as a light to navigate his own darkness, an anchor to keep him from drifting entirely into the abyss of the Dark Lord's service. It was selfish, and it was beautiful, and it was utterly terrifying. She stepped toward him, closing the gap until only a breath of air separated them. The tension between them, which had been building for weeks, suddenly felt like a physical weight, a magnetic pull that she no longer had the strength to resist. She reached up, her fingers grazing the lapel of his torn jacket before moving higher to cup his jaw. His skin was warm now, the blood she had cleaned leaving a faint metallic scent. "You're a fool, Draco Malfoy," she whispered. "I know," he breathed. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. They stood there in the silence, two enemies bound by a secret that was killing them both. The air was charged, electric, the space between their lips humming with the unspoken words of 100 arguments and 1,000 shared glances. He didn't kiss her. He didn't have to. The intimacy of the moment was deeper than any physical act. It was a recognition of souls. In the heart of the enemy's manor, surrounded by death and war, they had found a strange, distorted kind of peace. Then, the thunder finally broke, a deafening roar that shook the windows. The rain began to lash against the glass, a frantic, rhythmic drumming. Draco pulled back, the mask of the cold Malfoy air sliding back into place, but his eyes remained soft for a fraction of a second longer. "I have to go," he said, his voice regaining its composure. "The elves will bring you extra blankets. The storm will make the room cold." "Draco," she called as he reached the door. He paused. "Be careful, please." He didn't answer with words. He simply nodded, a sharp, curt movement, and stepped out into the dark hallway. Hermione listened to the lock click. She walked to the window and watched the rain wash over the glass, blurring the world outside into a mess of grey and black. She felt a strange new weight in her chest, a mixture of gratitude and dread. She was still a prisoner. She was still powerless. But as she touched the spot on her forehead where his breath had lingered, she realized that the walls of her cell were no longer made of stone. They were made of the sacrifices of a man who was willing to burn the world down just to keep her from feeling the heat. She sat on the bed and opened the book of poetry he had given her. But she couldn't focus on the words. She could only think of the blood on his face and the way his hand had felt in hers. She was falling for her captor, not out of weakness, but out of a shared, desperate humanity. And as the storm raged outside, she knew that when the war finally ended, there would be no clean escape for either of them. They were tied together by the very chains he had used to save her. The passage of time in the manor was a deceptive thing, marked only by the shifting angle of the shadows and the growing stack of books Draco surreptitiously added to the corner of the room. The isolation was beginning to warp Hermione's perception. The war felt like a distant fever dream, a story she had read in one of her Muggle novels, while the four walls of this chamber had become her entire universe. The emotional seesaw she lived on was exhausting. One day, she would wake up fueled by a cold, righteous fury, pacing the room and planning ways to strangle Draco with the silk sheets he provided. She would despise the way he looked at her, with that mixture of ownership and reverence, and she would curse the day she ever felt a flicker of sympathy for him. But then, evening would come, and he would enter the room looking so hollowed out, so utterly destroyed by the world outside, that her resolve would crumble into a pile of ash. Tonight, the air was particularly thick. A heat wave had settled over Wiltshire, and the heavy wards seemed to trap the humidity inside, making the room feel like a tomb. Hermione sat by the open window, though no breeze came through the magical barrier. She heard the lock click, a sound that now triggered a Pavlovian response of both dread and relief. and Draco entered. He didn't speak. He walked over to the washstand and splashed water on his face. When he turned around, he wasn't wearing his outer robes. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the pale, thin skin of his forearms. For the first time, Hermione saw it clearly. The dark mark, an ugly, writhing smudge of black ink against his porcelain skin. She flinched. The sight of it was a cold bucket of water over the budding warmth she had begun to feel. It was a reminder of who he was, of what he had done, and of the side he had chosen long before he decided to play savior. "Don't look at it," Draco said, his voice sharp and jagged. He pulled his sleeve down, but the damage was done. "How can I not?" Hermione asked, her voice trembling with a sudden surge of repulsion. "It's who you are, Draco. You can bring me books and lilies, you can treat my scratches and feed me fine food. But that mark, that's the truth of you. You're one of them." Draco's face hardened. The vulnerability she had seen during the storm was gone, replaced by a cold, aristocratic mask. He walked over to his usual chair and sat down, his movements stiff. "I am what I had to be to survive," he said. "Just as you are what you have to be to stay alive in this room. We are both playing roles, Granger. The only difference is that mine requires me to bleed in public, so you don't have to bleed in private." "You talk as if you're a martyr," she cried, standing up and walking toward him. "You chose that mark. You stood in that circle. You watched while they tortured people." "I watched so I would know how to fake it," Draco shouted, standing up to meet her. The space between them crackled with a familiar, dangerous tension. "Every time I saw a curse cast, I studied it. I learned the precise resonance of a scream, the exact way a body trembles under the Cruciatus, so that when I came up here to interrogate you, I could recreate the sounds perfectly. I am a monster, yes. I am a liar and a coward. But I am a monster who has spent every waking second of the last 3 months ensuring that you never have to see the face of the man who gave me that mark." He stepped closer, his chest nearly brushing hers. The smell of him, now sweat and stress and that persistent sandalwood, filled her lungs. "You want the truth? The Dark Lord thinks you're broken. He thinks you've lost your mind and that you're nothing but a catatonic shell. I've told him I've stripped your memories, that I've burned your brain until there's nothing left but a void. That is the only reason he hasn't summoned you." Hermione felt the blood drain from her face. The confessions she had made, the fake coordinates, the useless names of dead Order members. He hadn't used any of them. He hadn't even twisted them. He had simply erased her existence from the Dark Lord's radar. "You've been lying to him," she whispered. "Every day, for months." "Every single day," Draco breathed. "And every day the lie gets harder to maintain. He's starting to ask for proof. He wants to see the void for himself. He wants to visit this wing." The repulsion she had felt moments ago was suddenly replaced by a sickening wave of guilt. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the tremors in his hands. He was living on the edge of a blade, and she was the one pushing him toward the precipice. "Why?" she asked again, her voice a mere ghost of itself. "It's too much, Draco. No one is worth this, especially not a muggle-born girl you used to hate." Draco reached out, his hand moving with agonizing slowness. He cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing against her lower lip. The touch was so tender, so profoundly out of place in this house of horrors that it made her heart ache. "I didn't hate you," he whispered, his eyes searching hers. "I was jealous of you. You were everything I wasn't allowed to be. You were free to be brilliant. You were free to have friends who actually loved you. You were free to be good. I hated that you were lesser than me, and yet so much more." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "And now you're the only thing that's real. If I lose you, there's nothing left of Draco Malfoy but the mask. I can't let you go, Hermione. Not because I want to own you, but because I need to know that something good survived this war." The honesty in his voice was a physical weight. Hermione closed her eyes, her hand coming up to cover his on her cheek. The seesaw swung violently toward warmth, toward trust, toward something that felt dangerously like love. But it was a love born in a cage, a flower growing in a graveyard. "If he comes here," she whispered, "he'll kill us both." "He won't come here," Draco promised, though they both knew it was a lie. "I'll find another way. I'll give him something else." He pulled away then, the coldness returning as he realized how much he had revealed. He walked to the door, his hand lingering on the handle. "The Order won a skirmish near Bristol," he said, his back to her. "Potter was seen. He's alive. He's looking for you." "Harry," she breathed, a pang of longing for her old life sharp in her chest. "Don't," Draco said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave. "Don't think about them. Not here. It only makes the walls feel tighter." He left then, and for the first time Hermione didn't pace. She sat on the bed and stared at the door. She thought about the dark mark on his arm and the way his thumb had felt on her lip. She was beginning to realize the true nature of her captivity. It wasn't the wards or the locked door that kept her here. It was the fact that she was the only person who knew the truth about Draco Malfoy. She was the keeper of his soul, and he was the keeper of her life. They were locked in a stalemate of survival. As the night deepened, she heard a sound she had never heard before in the manor, the sound of someone weeping. It was muffled, coming from the room across the hall, Draco's room. It wasn't the loud, theatrical wailing of a child, but the quiet, rhythmic sobbing of a man who had finally realized that his sanctuary was just another kind of prison. Hermione walked to the door and pressed her ear against the wood. She wanted to call out to him. She wanted to tell him she was there, but she didn't. She stayed silent, listening to the sound of her jailer's heart breaking, and realized with a terrifying clarity that she was no longer waiting for the war to end. She was waiting for the moment when the lie would finally be enough to kill them both. The next day, Draco didn't come at all. A house elf brought her food, its eyes wide with terror, refusing to speak. The air in the manor felt electric, as if a storm were about to break inside the house itself. Hermione spent the day in a state of high-strung anxiety, every sound in the hallway making her jump. When Draco finally appeared, it was after midnight. He was covered in soot, and there was a frantic, wild energy about him. "Pack nothing," he said, grabbing her arm. "We don't have time." "What's happening?" she asked, her heart racing. "He's coming. Now. He's at the gates." Draco looked at her, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "The interrogation is over, Hermione. I have to move you." He pulled her toward the secret passage behind the tapestry, his grip bruising. In that moment, the seesaw tipped back to fear. He was acting like a captor again, forceful and frantic. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded, struggling against him. "To the cellar," he hissed. "It's the only place the wards might hold if he starts searching the rooms. Move." As they descended into the dark, damp belly of the manor, Hermione realized that the protection Draco offered was becoming indistinguishable from the threat he was protecting her from. He was dragging her deeper into the darkness, deeper into his own web of lies, and she didn't know if they would ever see the light again. The door to the cellar slammed shut, and for the first time, Draco didn't just lock it. He stayed inside with her, the two of them huddled in the dark as the sound of the Dark Lord's arrival echoed through the floorboards above. The hunter was at the door, and the prey and the protector were trapped together in the dark. The cellar was a cavern of cold, weeping stone and the smell of ancient dust. Above them, the manor groaned under the weight of a presence so foul it seemed to poison the very air filtering through the floorboards. The Dark Lord had arrived, and with him, the thin veil of safety Draco had woven around Hermione began to fray. Draco sat against the damp wall, his knees pulled to his chest, his wand held loosely in a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. The only light came from a single, dying lumos at the tip of his wand, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced across the wine racks and empty crates. Hermione stood a few feet away, her breath coming in shallow, silent gasps. The psychological tension was so thick, it felt like physical pressure against her chest. "He's in the drawing room," Draco whispered, his voice barely a breath. "I can feel him. It's like a needle pressing against the back of my skull." Hermione moved closer, her repulsion at his mark warred with a sudden, sharp pang of empathy. In the flickering light, he looked like a boy again, small, terrified, and utterly alone. "Draco, if he finds me here, in the cellar, there is no lie left to tell. He will kill you before he even looks at me." "I know," Draco rasped. He looked up at her, his eyes hollow. "I've spent months building a maze of false memories and forged reports. I thought I was so clever. I thought I could outrun him. But he's not looking for information anymore, Hermione. He's looking for blood. He's bored." The sound of a heavy door slamming upstairs echoed down the stone steps. Hermione flinched, her hand instinctively reaching out to find Draco's. She expected him to pull away, to regain his mask of cold indifference, but instead he gripped her hand with a strength that spoke of pure, unadulterated terror. "If the door opens," he said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent tone, "I want you to run. There's a passage behind the third rack. It leads to the woods. The wards are weakest there." "I won't leave you," she said, the words surprising even herself. "You have to," he hissed, his grip tightening. "Don't you understand? This was never about me being a hero. It was about making sure that at least one thing I touched didn't turn to ash. If you stay and we both die, then everything I've done, every lie I've told, every time I've let them hurt me to protect you, it all becomes meaningless." He stood up, pulling her with him. They were so close she could feel the frantic thrumming of his heart against her own. The emotional seesaw swung violently toward a desperate, tragic warmth. He wasn't her captor in this moment. He was her shield, and the weight of that realization was staggering. "You've been keeping me here to save your own soul," she whispered, her eyes searching his. "But what about mine, Draco? How am I supposed to live with the knowledge that you died so I could sit in a room and read poetry?" You live by winning, he said, his face hardening. You live by finding Potter and ending this. You live so that someone remembers that I wasn't just a mark on an arm. Suddenly, the cellar door at the top of the stairs creaked open. A sliver of light from the hallway spilled down the steps, and the sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps began to descend. Thump, thump, thump. Draco's face went bloodless. He shoved Hermione toward the wine racks, his eyes wide. Go, now, Draco. Silencio, he whispered, his wand pointed at her. The world went silent for Hermione. She tried to scream, to protest, but no sound came. He shoved her behind the heavy oak frame of the racks, his hands lingering for a fraction of a second on her shoulders, a touch that felt like a goodbye. She watched through the gaps in the wood as a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't the Dark Lord. It was Lucius Malfoy. Her father looked like a ghost of the man he once was. His hair was lank, his eyes sunken and rimmed with red. He held a cane in one hand and a wand in the other, his gaze sweeping the cellar with a mixture of suspicion and weariness. Draco, Lucius said, his voice thin and reedy. The Dark Lord is asking for you. He finds your absence disrespectful. I was checking the stores, Father, Draco said, his voice remarkably steady, though Hermione could see his hands clenched behind his back. The house elves have been sluggish. Lucius stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. He sniffed the air, his nose wrinkling. There is a scent in here, something that doesn't belong. It smells of girl. Hermione froze, her heart stopping in her chest. She pressed herself harder against the cold stone, the silent spell Draco had cast, the only thing keeping her frantic breathing from being heard. Draco didn't blink. I had a girl here earlier, one of the Snatcher's prizes. I was testing her. Lucius sneered, a flash of his old arrogance returning. You always did have a penchant for the common, Draco. But now is not the time for your tawdry distractions. He wants an update on the Granger girl. He's tired of hearing that her mind is a void. He wants to see the body. I disposed of her, Father, Draco said, the lie falling from his lips with terrifying ease. Weeks ago, I told you she didn't survive the final extraction. I didn't want to trouble the Dark Lord with a failure. Lucius stared at his son for a long, agonizing minute. The tension in the room was a physical chord, stretched to the point of snapping. Hermione watched Draco's profile, amazed by his restraint, by the absolute stillness of his body. He was gambling everything on this single, audacious lie. You disposed of her, Lucius repeated, his voice trailing off. He looked toward the wine racks, his gaze lingering on the exact spot where Hermione was hidden. And you didn't think to show me the proof, to let me see the end of the mudblood who caused our family so much grief. There was nothing left to see, Draco said coldly. Now, shall we go? We shouldn't keep him waiting. Lucius lingered for another second, his eyes searching the shadows, before he finally turned. You are playing a dangerous game, Draco. I hope for your sake that you are as good a liar as your mother. They ascended the stairs, the door clicking shut behind them. Hermione remained in the darkness, the silent spell eventually wearing off, leaving her gasping for air in the sudden vacuum of sound. She was alone, truly alone for the first time in months. The passage Draco had mentioned was right there, a dark mouth in the wall beckoning her toward freedom, toward Harry, toward the life she had lost. She could leave. She could run into the woods and never look back. But as she stood there, her legs shaking, she realized she couldn't move. The protection Draco had forced upon her had become a bond she didn't know how to break. If she left now, he would be alone with the lie. He would be alone with his father and the monster in the drawing room. She sat on the cold floor, clutching her knees. She thought of the way Draco had looked at her before he pushed her away, the sheer, selfless terror in his eyes. He had given her an out. He had given her the freedom she had begged for. And yet, the thought of the manor without her in it, of Draco facing the darkness without the one light he had fought to keep, felt like a betrayal. Hours passed. The cellar was silent, save for the distant, muffled sounds of the manor's dark inhabitants. Hermione moved to the passage, her hand touching the cold stone of the hidden door. She could hear the wind whistling through the trees outside. It smelled of pine and rain and liberty. She took a step into the passage, then stopped. She remembered the poem in the book he had given her. I am the master of my fate. She turned back toward the cellar stairs. She wasn't a master of anything if her survival was built on the bones of someone else's sacrifice. She wouldn't run like a thief in the night. She waited. When the door finally opened again, it was nearly dawn. Draco stumbled down the steps, his face bruised, his lips split and bleeding. He looked at the empty cellar, his eyes darting to the open passage, and a look of profound, crushing relief washed over him. He slumped against the wall, his head falling back. "She's gone," he whispered to the empty room. "Thank God. She's finally gone." "No, I'm not," Hermione said, stepping out from behind the racks. Draco's head snapped up. He looked at her as if she were a ghost, his expression shifting from shock to a sudden violent fury. He lunged forward, grabbing her by the shoulders and shaking her. "Why?" he roared, his voice cracking. "I gave you the way out. I lied to his face. I took a beating for a corpse that wasn't there. Why are you still here, you insufferable stubborn?" "Because I won't let you do this alone," she shouted back, her tears finally spilling over. She reached up and grabbed his wrists, her fingers digging into his skin. "You think you're the only one who can make a choice. You think you're the only one who can sacrifice something. I am not your pet, Draco. I am not a prize to be saved. I am a person, and I choose to stay until we both get out." The fury drained out of him as quickly as it had come. He let go of her shoulders, his hands sliding down to her waist, his forehead dropping to her shoulder. He was shaking. Great, racked shudders that tore through his thin frame. "You're a fool," he sobbed into her neck. "You've just signed your death warrant." "Then we'll sign it together," she whispered, her arms winding around him, holding him together as the first light of a grey, war-torn morning began to bleed through the small, barred windows of their prison. The seesaw had stopped. There was no more repulsion, no more doubt. There was only the terrifying, inevitable reality of two people who had found each other in the wreckage of a dying world, and the knowledge that the hardest part was yet to come. The cellar had become their command center, a cold, subterranean womb where the final remnants of their old lives were shed like winter skin. The manor above them was no longer just a house. It was a breathing, predatory beast, its lungs filled with the toxic presence of the Dark Lord's inner circle. Every floorboard that groaned, every distant cackle of Bellatrix Lestrange felt like a countdown. Hermione sat on a crate, her fingers tracing the intricate runes of a protective ward she was helping Draco weave into the cellar walls. The emotional seesaw had settled into a heavy, grounding tension, a quiet before the storm. They were no longer jailer and prisoner, but they were not quite lovers either. They were two survivors standing on a collapsing bridge, holding onto each other, because letting go meant falling into the void. Draco worked opposite her, his movements precise and frantic. The bruising on his face had faded to a sickly yellow-green, and he moved with a gingerly stiffness that spoke of internal injuries he refused to acknowledge. He hadn't touched her since their breakdown the night before, as if the physical expression of their bond was too dangerous to sustain. "The wards won't hold if he brings the whole circle down here," Draco said, his voice flat. He didn't look up from the chalk circles he was drawing on the floor. "But they'll give us 30 seconds. 30 seconds to reach the passage." "And then what?" Hermione asked. "We reach the woods. We're wandless. Well, I'm wandless, and the Snatchers are everywhere. What's the plan, Draco? Or is the plan just to die in the mud instead of the stone?" Draco stopped. He looked at her, and for a moment the old Malfoy arrogance flickered in his eyes, a ghost of the boy who thought he could control the world. "I have a wand for you." Hermione's heart skipped. "You found mine. You said you burned it." "I did burn it," he said, reaching into the inner pocket of his coat. He pulled out a slender length of dark wood. It wasn't hers. It was walnut, unyielding and cold. "This was my father's backup, dragon heartstring. It's temperamental and it will fight you, but it's better than nothing." He held it out, but as Hermione reached for it, he pulled it back just an inch. His eyes were dark with a sudden, sharp conflict. "If I give you this," he whispered, "I lose my leverage. I lose the one thing that keeps you from running away from me the moment we hit the tree line." The air in the cellar grew stagnant. The honesty of his fear was a physical weight. Hermione looked at the wand, then at the man holding it. She saw the obsession, the distorted protection that had characterized her entire stay. He wanted her safe, but he also wanted her dependent. He wanted to be her only world because he was terrified of what he would be in hers. "You never had leverage, Draco," she said softly, her voice steady. "You had a choice. You could have been the boy who let me die, or the man who saved me. You chose the man. Don't go back to the boy now." She reached out and wrapped her fingers around the wand, her hand brushing his. A jolt of mismatched magic sparked between them, a sharp, stinging reminder that they were fundamentally different. But she didn't let go. She pulled the wand from his grip, feeling its cold power settle into her palm. "I'm not running from you," she promised, "but I'm not staying in this cellar to be a trophy for your conscience. We leave tonight." Draco let out a jagged breath, his shoulders sagging. "Tonight, the Dark Lord is moving toward Hogwarts. He thinks the final battle is there. The manor will be as empty as it ever gets." He stood up, walking toward her until he was close enough to touch. He reached out, his hand hovering near her hair before he tucked a stray curl behind her ear. His touch was hesitant, as if he were trying to memorize the texture of her skin. "If we make it out," he murmured, his eyes searching hers. "If there's a world left after tomorrow, what happens to us? Do we go back to being a Death Eater and a war hero? Do we pretend this room never happened?" Hermione looked at him, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the tragedy they were living. They were bonded by trauma, by secrets, and by a strange claustrophobic intimacy that could only exist in the shadow of death. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't think I can ever go back to who I was, and I don't think you can either." She stepped into his space, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She could feel the rapid, uneven beat of his heart. The silence between them was no longer a cage. It was a sanctuary. "But I know that I won't let them take you," she said, her voice hardening with a fierce, newfound resolve. "If we're going to burn, we burn together." Draco leaned down, his face inches from hers. The tension that had been simmering for months finally reached its boiling point. He didn't wait for her to move. He closed the distance, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was neither romantic nor soft. It was desperate. It was a collision of two people trying to prove they were still alive. It tasted of salt and copper and the metallic tang of fear. It was heavy with the things they couldn't say, the apologies, the accusations, the terror of the coming dawn. Hermione gripped his shirt, pulling him closer, her intelligence colliding with the raw, primal need for connection. She felt his hands slide into her hair, gripping her with a possessiveness that she no longer fought. In that moment, the line between devotion and obsession blurred completely. He was her captor, her savior, her enemy, and her anchor. She was his prize, his burden, his conscience, and his light. They pulled apart, both gasping for air, their eyes locked in a shared, terrifying understanding. The kiss hadn't solved anything. It hadn't redeemed him, and it hadn't freed her. It had only made the stakes of their escape impossibly high. "Tonight," Draco repeated, his voice a gravelly rasp. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the manor. The cellar ceiling rained dust and small pebbles upon them. Screams echoed from the floors above, not the calculated screams of a performance, but the raw, frantic cries of a house under attack. "The Order," Hermione breathed, her eyes widening. "They're here." "No," Draco said, his face going ashen as he listened to the specific frequency of the magic tearing through the air. "That's not the Order. That's him. He's found out, Hermione. The lies, they've collapsed." He grabbed her hand, his grip crushing. "The passage! Now!" They scrambled toward the wine racks, but before they could reach the hidden door, the cellar stairs exploded in a shower of stone and splinters. A figure stood in the doorway, framed by the green light of the dark mark blooming in the sky outside. It was Bellatrix. She looked skeletal, her hair a wild halo of madness, her eyes fixed on the two of them with a predatory glee. She didn't look at Hermione. She looked at Draco. "My little nephew," she crooned, her voice a jagged blade. "Playing house with a mudblood in the dark. Did you really think the Dark Lord wouldn't notice the stench of your treason?" Draco stepped in front of Hermione, his wand raised, his body a trembling shield. "Get out, Aunt Bella." "Oh, I'm not leaving, Draco," she laughed, a high, thin sound that made Hermione's skin crawl. "I'm here to clean up the mess, and then I'm going to watch him peel the skin from your bones while you beg for the death you gave this girl." Hermione felt the walnut wand hum in her hand, a cold, hungry energy. She didn't wait for Draco to act. She didn't wait for a plan. She stepped out from behind him, her eyes burning with a defiance that had been forged in months of isolation. "He didn't give me death," Hermione said, her voice echoing in the stone chamber. "He gave me time, and now I'm going to use it." She cast the first spell, a jagged burst of silver light that took Bellatrix by surprise. Draco followed instantly, his magic dark and sharp, a reflection of the man he had become. The battle in the cellar was a blur of light and shadow, a claustrophobic dance of death. Hermione fought with a desperation she had never known, her mind working in perfect, silent tandem with Draco's. They moved as one, a singular entity of survival. But as they pushed Bellatrix back toward the stairs, Hermione saw the price of their defiance. The manor was crumbling. The wards Draco had built to protect her were being torn apart by the raw power of the Dark Lord's fury. "The passage!" Draco screamed over the roar of the magic. "Go, Hermione! I'll hold her!" "No!" she screamed back. "We go together!" She grabbed him by the collar, her strength fueled by a terror that was no longer for herself. She dragged him toward the wine rack, her wand blasting a hole through the wood. They tumbled into the dark passage just as the cellar door was ripped from its hinges. The sound of Bellatrix's scream followed them as they fled into the narrow, damp tunnel, the earth shaking around them. They ran until their lungs burned, until the smell of the manor was replaced by the cold, fresh scent of the night air. When they finally burst through the hidden exit at the base of a cliff, the world was on fire. In the distance, the silhouette of Hogwarts was a jagged tooth against a sky filled with spells. The war had reached its climax. Draco fell to his knees in the wet grass, his chest heaving. He looked back at the manor, which was now a smoking ruin on the hill. Everything he had ever known, his name, his family, his safety, was gone. Hermione stood over him, the walnut wand still clutched in her hand. She looked down at him, her heart heavy with a freedom that felt like a wound. She was alive. She was free. But the cost was written in the blood on Draco's hands and the shattered look in his eyes. She knelt beside him, her hand finding his. "We're out," she whispered. "Draco, look at me. We're out." He looked at her, and the question remained unresolved in the depths of his grey eyes. Could something born from captivity ever be separated from it? Could they ever be anything more than the prisoner and the jailer who had found a reason to stay in the dark? The wind howled through the trees, a cold, indifferent witness to their survival. The final battle was calling, but for a moment, in the shadow of the cliff, they were the only two people left in the world. The aftermath of the Battle of Hogwarts was not a triumphant roar, but a long, shuddering silence. The morning light that crawled over the Scottish Highlands was pale and indifferent, illuminating a landscape of rubble, smoke, and the heavy scent of spent magic. Hermione stood on the edge of the great hall, her robes torn, her face smeared with soot and the dried blood of others. She had found Harry. She had found Ron. She had fought, and they had won. But as the survivors wept and embraced, Hermione felt a hollow space in her chest that no victory could fill. She was free, but the agency she had regained felt like a heavy, ill-fitting garment. Every time someone touched her arm in celebration, she flinched, her skin still calibrated to the specific, desperate pressure of Draco Malfoy's grip. She found him in the shadow of the astronomy tower, far from the crowds. He was sitting on a fallen stone gargoyle, his head bowed, his hands resting limply on his knees. He looked small against the backdrop of the ruined castle. a boy whose world had ended twice in a single night. He was no longer a Death Eater, but he was not a hero. He was a ghost, caught between the gravity of his crimes and the weight of his survival. Hermione approached him slowly, her boots crunching on the glass and stone. The emotional seesaw had finally come to a stop, but it had landed on a point of agonizing complexity. She didn't know if she should thank him or curse him. She didn't know if she loved him or if she was simply addicted to the safety he had forced upon her. "Draco," she said, her voice sounding foreign in the open air. He didn't look up, but his shoulders stiffened. "You should be with them, Granger. The victors are inside. They're counting the dead and making legends out of the living. You don't belong out here with the wreckage." "I don't feel like a victor," she said, stepping closer. She leaned against the cold stone wall, looking out at the forbidden forest. "I feel like I'm still in that cellar. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the lock turning." Draco finally looked at her. His grey eyes were bloodshot and weary, stripped of all the shields he had worn in the manor. "That was the point of the lock, wasn't it? To make sure that was the only world you knew. I thought if I kept you small enough, the war couldn't find you. I was a fool." "You weren't a fool," she countered, her voice dropping. "You were a man who burned his own house down to keep me warm. But Draco, you didn't just save my life. You stole my choice. You made my survival a debt I never asked to owe." The psychological tension between them, once claustrophobic and sharp, had become something more profound, a shared trauma that bound them together more tightly than any chain. Hermione looked at his hands, seeing the raw red marks where he had fought to pull her through the passage. She realized then that their relationship wasn't a romance. It was a reckoning. Draco stood up, the movement slow and pained. He walked toward her until he was standing just inches away, his shadow falling over her. He didn't reach for her. He stayed in that state of restrained precision that was his only remaining defense. "The Aurors will come for me soon," he said, his voice a low, steady rasp. "My mother is already in custody. My father, I don't know where he is. I'll be going to the ministry and then probably to Azkaban. The lies won't be enough this time." "I'll testify," Hermione said immediately. "I'll tell them what you did. I'll tell them about the reports, the false interrogations, the cellar." "Why?" Draco asked, a flicker of that old, dark intensity returning to his gaze. "To balance the scales? To pay back the debt? I didn't save you so you could be my character witness, Hermione. I saved you because I couldn't bear the thought of a world where you didn't exist." He reached out then, his hand trembling as it hovered near her face. He didn't cup her cheek as he had in the manor. Instead, he let his fingers brush against the collar of her robes, a touch that was heavy, conflicted, and utterly necessary. It was a physical acknowledgement of everything they had endured, the terror, the obsession, the distorted care. Hermione didn't pull away. She stepped into the touch, her own hand coming up to grip his wrist. The contact was electric, but it wasn't the spark of a first kiss. It was the heavy, grounding pull of two people who had seen the worst of each other and had nowhere else to go. "I can't let you go," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "Not because I'm your prisoner, but because I don't know who I am without the man who kept me alive." Draco's face fractured. The absolute control he had maintained through months of captivity and hours of battle finally gave way. He pulled her into him, his arms wrapping around her with a fierce, suffocating strength. He buried his face in her hair, his breath coming in jagged, broken sobs. Hermione held him back, her fingers digging into the fabric of his torn suit. They stood there in the ruins of their world, a damaged freedom stretching out before them. This wasn't a beginning, and it wasn't a happy ending. It was a survival bought at a cost that neither of them could yet calculate. "You're free, Hermione," he murmured against her skin. "Do you understand? The door is open. You can walk away. You can go back to being the girl you were before I took you." "That girl died in the ministry," she said, pulling back just enough to look into his eyes. "The woman standing here, she's the one you made, and she doesn't want to walk away." She reached up and took his face in her hands. The physical expression was not comforting. It was a claim. She kissed him, a long, heavy, and desperate kiss that tasted of salt and the cold morning air. It was a kiss that acknowledged the kidnapping, the control, the obsession, and the love that had grown like a weed in the cracks of it all. It was a kiss that couldn't justify anything, but it was the only truth they had left. When they broke apart, the sound of voices and footsteps approached from the castle. The world was coming for them. The reality of the law, the judgment of their friends, and the scars of the war would soon descend. Draco looked toward the approaching auras, his jaw tightening. He turned back to Hermione one last time, his thumb brushing over her lip, erasing the taste of the kiss before the world could see it. "Go," he whispered. "Don't let them see you with me. Not yet." "I'm not leaving you, Draco," she said, her voice a vow. She took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his, the walnut wand tucked into her belt, a weapon she had used to save him, a weapon that had belonged to his father. They stood together as the first of the ministry officials rounded the corner. As the sun finally cleared the horizon, bathing the ruins in a harsh, unforgiving light, Hermione felt the weight of the question that would haunt them forever. Can something born from captivity ever be truly separated from it? Can a love that was built on the ruins of autonomy ever be healthy? Or will it always carry the scent of the cellar? There were no answers in the morning light. There was only the warmth of his hand in hers, and the long, difficult road of redemption ahead. The freedom they had won was real, but it was damaged, fractured by the very methods used to secure it. As the auras reached them, Hermione didn't let go of his hand. She looked at the man who had been her jailer and her savior, and she realized that while the war was over, their struggle had only just begun. They were survivors of a dark, morally ambiguous love story, and the world would never understand the price they had paid to stay in the shadows together. The story ended, not with a resolution, but with a step forward into a future where the line between protection and control would have to be redrawn, inch by agonizing inch. "I have you," she whispered as they led him away. "I have you." And for the first time since the night in the ministry, the lock in her heart finally clicked into place, not to keep her in, but to keep the rest of the world out.
Thank you for staying with me until the end. This story is not a happy fairy tale, it is a story about dark times. Draco and Hermione were never supposed to be together. He was her enemy. He took her freedom. but in the world of death he chose to save her life. It is law, or it's just a way to survive. I don't have the answer. Maybe you do. Sometimes the person who hurts you is also the person who protects you. It is a scary thought. It is a heavy thought. I wanted to show that even in the dark there is a spark. It is not always beautiful. Sometimes it burns. Thank you for listening to my words. Law is complicated. Magic is dangerous. See you in the next story.